They called Elias Cole a monster the day he walked past the warehouse scales with a shotgun in his hands. For years before that, in the Carolina Sandhills, folks knew him as the quiet neighbor who fixed fences after storms. On an October morning in 1985, those two pictures met beside a red brick tobacco warehouse humming with new machines. Smoke from cured leaf mixed with gunpowder as farmhands dropped between loaded wagons and yellow weigh-in tickets skittered across concrete. While men crawled for cover, Elias set a stained notebook and a little cassette tape beside the glowing digital display. He had tracked weights, prices, and names for months, building a record he believed no man in Raleigh could ignore. By dusk, 15 men would be dead, and this county would argue for decades over what he really was. Tonight, we'll walk that dock, those fields, and paper trail, and ask why a farmer chose murder over surrender. Settle in, tell me where you're watching from, and hold that question while we start. To understand how a man with a shotgun could also be the neighbor who fixed fences, we have to step back. That October morning at the warehouse was only the end of a long squeeze that started in red sand and thin pine shade. Before sirens, there were just bills on a kitchen table and a quiet farmer who wrote down every penny. Steam rose from black coffee as dawn came through the Cole farmhouse window. Elias sat in his work shirt, shoulders rounded, a yellow pad in front of him. Ruth slid eggs from a pan onto chipped plates and watched him line up numbers with a dull pencil. "We can't keep stretching like this, Eli," she said, voice soft so the boys in the next room wouldn't hear. He nodded once, eyes on the column of fuel costs, seed, and last year's warehouse checks. Fields around them lay in long, pale rows, sandy soil broken by tobacco, scrub, and rusted cars. The old textile mill in town had gone quiet, its tall brick stack cold. Men who once ran looms now hired on by the day to help strip leaf, haul sticks, fix trucks. A good crop no longer promised a good year. It just meant the bank held off a little longer before calling. Pride kept most folks from saying the word poor out loud. They talked instead about lean years and slow times and prayed rain would fall right. A few still ran jars of white liquor down dirt roads at night, trading something illegal yet familiar for cash that could not be traced. Nobody bragged about it in church, but nobody was shocked either when they smelled corn mash under a shed. Down in town, the red brick tobacco warehouse sat like a courthouse for dirt farmers. Every fall, trucks and wagons lined up, and men's whole seasons were turned into numbers on little slips. The warehouses had started using new electronic scales and a small computer to print tickets. Clay Pike helped sell that change, promising faster weigh-ins and fewer mistakes. Most growers just saw more lights and buttons they did not control. Out beyond the loading dock, law came on in two thin layers. You had the sheriff's car rolling slow at night, and the state trooper now and then on Highway 1. Above that sat Raleigh and Washington, far away as the moon. Closer to home lived another set of rules past its supper tables and work sheds. You respected a man's land. You did not cheat him face to face. You sure did not steal his family craft and laugh about it over coffee. Elias walked both worlds without saying much. At the co-op meeting, he sat in the back and listened. At home, he counted every sack, every gallon, every mile. He kept wire-bound ledgers on a pantry shelf, pages filled with dates, weights, rain days, labor owed. While other men trusted memory and luck, he trusted ink. Those books were his way of fighting back against foggy promises and smooth talk. One afternoon that summer, Jacob watched his father fold an old warehouse check beside a newer one. The numbers did not match the loads he remembered dragging. "Maybe it's the new machine, Daddy," the boy said. Elias did not answer. He just drew a small circle around the printed weight, then wrote the true load in the margin. That tiny ring of pencil was the first mark in a trail that would later fill cardboard boxes in a far-off evidence room. Next, we'll step into the heat of the curing barn, where the real heart of the Cole name hung from the rafters. Inside the curing barn, the air felt thick and sweet, like hot syrup on the tongue. Rows of yellow-green leaves hung from rafters in long, sagging lines, each stalk pinned with a small notch Elias had used since boyhood. Heat from the fireboxes rolled upward, turning the air into a slow, breathing thing. This dark wooden room held more of the Cole name than any courthouse ever would. When Elias moved through that space, he did it with the slow care of a man walking through a church. One hand checked a leaf for color, the other brushed the old wall where he had scratched notes years before. Tiny marks showed dates, weather, and little changes in fire. Every inch of that barn carried a story in smoke and ash. Most folks only saw the end of the work, neat hands of cured leaf tied with twine, stacked and ready for the warehouse floor. They did not see the long nights when Elias slept on a cot by the door, waking every hour to feed wood, open vents, or shut them. They did not see the cheap kitchen thermometer he'd wired to a nail, or the way he wrote down numbers every time he checked it. Jacob, tall and lean, trailed his father down the alley between hanging rows. His shirt stuck to his back, and sweat ran into his eyes. Still, he watched how Elias pinched a leaf, rolled the tip, and listened to the faint crackle. No words came with the lesson that day. The boy learned instead from small looks and the slow pacing of boots on packed dirt. On nights when the fire had to be watched close, Tommy curled up on old feed sacks in a corner, the barn light turning his hair the color of the leaves above him. Elias sat by the open firebox door, face lit in orange, a spiral notebook on his knee. He wrote numbers, short lines, and little arrows, using a ruler so each column stayed straight. The scratch of the pencil mixed with the hiss of sap and smoke. Years later, those notebooks would sit in a gray plastic bin in a state evidence room. Investigators would flip through pages stiff from years of heat and sweat and see not just a farmer's habit, but a pattern of care that matched his later ledgers and tapes. In 1985, though, they were just his way of keeping control in a world that felt like it was sliding away. By the end of that summer, the color everyone in the county called coal red showed in the upper rows. Deep, rich, almost like brick in late sun, it meant higher prices and quiet respect. Old men at the co-op nodded when Elias brought in those hands. They might not say much, but they knew good work when they saw it. Across those same weeks, Clay Pike made more visits than usual. He leaned on the barn doorframe with his easy grin, shoes still clean from the hardware store floor. "You've always had a touch with fire, Eli," he'd say, eyes drifting up to the glow in the rafters. Elias would nod, say little, and go back to checking the vents. Jacob watched that too, and wondered why his father's shoulders went a little tighter whenever Clay's truck pulled in. Near the back wall, a single board carried deeper scratches than the rest. Names and short dates cut into the wood marked 3 generations of Coles who had tended those fires. Elias's father, Marcus, had carved his with a pocket knife after the war. Elias had added his own after Vietnam, the year he almost lost the barn to a wind shift but saved the leaf with one hard night of work. Under that board, on a rough shelf, lay a metal box with a lock that hardly anyone noticed. Inside lay the older notebooks, wrapped in oiled cloth. Elias had started filling them during his first season home from overseas, writing things his father only ever spoke aloud. It was his way of trapping something that felt like it could be stolen if left only in memory. From the doorway, sometimes Ruth watched her husband and sons move among the hanging leaves. She did not care about numbers on pages the way Elias did, but she understood how his whole body eased a little in that heat, how he seemed more himself there than at the kitchen table with bills. This is what he'll leave them, not land, not money, just this way of making brown leaf red. Right there in that barn, with its smoke-blacked rafters and scribbled boards, the true weight of what would be taken from him began to form. Every note, every mark, every careful test of color built a wall in his mind. When he later saw that same shade of red hanging in other men's barns and watched other names written on top of his work, those quiet nights by the fire would not let him walk away. The first time Elias saw that deep red hanging in another man's barn, he stood very still. Smoke curled up to a tin roof that wasn't his, and the color on those leaves matched the shade he had chased for half his life. Clay Pike waved from the doorway like it was just another neighborly visit. Clay's place sat closer to town, on flatter ground. The Pike barns were newer, with metal roofs and smooth boards. Clay had money tied up in more than one thing: the hardware store on Main, a small farm, a few rental trailers, and lately, the tobacco buying business. Folks said he was enterprising. Bankers called him overextended, though they never used that word to his face. Inside his office at Pike Farm and Hardware, the air smelled of rubber boots, fertilizer dust, and cheap coffee. A calendar with a cigarette brand girl hung crooked on the wall. Bills lay in a stack under a paperweight shaped like a tiny tractor. Clay kept the blinds half closed, hiding how thin the light had become over his accounts. On paper, he owed for new trucks, warehouse improvements, and the shiny electronic scale system he'd pushed the warehouse to buy. Off paper, he owed men he'd promised steady work and higher prices. Around his kitchen table, he owed 2 kids who needed shoes and a wife who was tired of saying, "Next year will be better." He had not started out planning to steal anything sacred. At first, he just wanted to stand closer to the kind of work Elias did in that dark barn. Over long drives and coffee on tailgates, he listened when Elias muttered about fireboxes and vent timing. A question here, a nod there. You open up when the stem's still bendy? You hold back when the weather's damp? Elias, thinking they were just 2 men trying to beat the weather, answered in short, careful phrases. Bit by bit, Clay wrote those phrases in his own notebook at the store. He changed a few words, added his own terms like stage 1, stage 2. It felt to him like organizing more than stealing. By the time his cousin Daryl asked how he got such good color on test strips hanging in a side shed, Clay had a neat little way of teaching what he had learned the slow way from Elias. Just watch the temp and the bend, he told Daryl, tapping the page, and don't be scared to stay up all night if the leaf asks you to. Cousins and hired hands listened, grateful for any edge that might keep them on land their families barely held. The real break came when the warehouse owner, tired of slow lines and human error, let Clay bring in a salesman with a demo rig. The new system had an electronic scale head, a small gray computer box, and a dot matrix printer that spit out tickets. Clay vouched for it in front of a room full of farmers. No more arguing over handwriting, he promised. Numbers won't lie when a machine reads them. In truth, the machine only seemed honest. A few keystrokes could shift how pounds were rounded. A quiet calibration change before opening could make one man's load seem lighter and another's seem heavy. Clay learned this from the salesman, who showed him how to tweak for shrinkage and dockage. It was meant for small fixes. Clay saw a door for bigger moves. Records from that year, pulled later from old floppy disks, showed who logged in before dawn and who touched settings. The same initials kept showing up. RCP. On a grainy maintenance form, now scanned into a state archive, a note reads, "Adjusted baseline per Clay's instruction." At the time, it was just a scribble in the back office. That first season with the new scales, Clay's buyers brought in leaf that looked almost exactly like cold red. Hands tied neat, color like brick, aroma rich but not burnt. Warehousemen walked the lines, sniffed, and nodded. "Pike's got himself a magic touch this year," one said. The words hit Elias like a slap when they floated back down the line. On the books, Clay's loads gained a few pounds they should not have had. Elias fell a few short. It was only a little at first, 2%, 3%, just enough that a man looking quick would blame dry weather or a sloppy hand on the wagon. Clay told himself it was harmless, just balancing out years when he'd felt shorted. Besides, he'd say in his mind, Elias still had his method. I'm only using what I helped build. From the narrator's distance, we know better. We can see how the small adjustments and borrowed tricks crossed a line the local code treated as hard as steel. The court documents would later call it fraud. Elias's private words for it ran much hotter. One late summer evening, Elias drove past a Pike barn with its doors half open. The light inside burned gold on rows of hanging red. He did not stop. He did not need to. His eyes told him enough. That exact shade, that exact droop in the leaves, came from a narrow path he and his father had carved, not from any manual Clay had bought with hardware profit. Clay, standing in his office that same week, stared at his own ledger. New contracts from a regional co-op lay on the desk, based on samples cured with the stolen method. "They want this color," he whispered, more to himself than anyone.
They'll pay for it, and I can finally dig out. That thought let him ignore the older rule he'd grown up hearing on porches: you don't take a man's hard. By the time word spread in town that Clay's barns had gone red in a single season, the theft was not a secret between two men anymore. It was a rumor running down dirt roads and pew rows. The day an old-timer at the co-op called it Pike Red as a joke, the last cover fell away. Now everyone could see another man's name on top of work born in the coal barn. What Elias would do about that, nobody yet knew. The only person who had a hint was a quiet woman in the warehouse office who saw more than most from behind her ticket printer.
Marla Jessup sat behind the ticket printer every weigh day, fingers stained with ink instead of dirt. From that little desk at the back of the warehouse office, she watched more than men thought she did. She saw who joked with Clay, who left mad, and which tickets made a farmer's shoulders sag as he walked back to his truck. Most days, she kept her head down. Single mother, small paycheck, no room for trouble. The warehouse owner liked that she worked fast and didn't gossip loud. Still, she noticed when the new electronic scale came in and certain names started getting lucky weights. The machine hummed and spat out slips, but the glow on the screen could change after Clay spent a few quiet minutes in the control room. Late one afternoon, when the line had thinned and broom handles scraped the dock clean, Elias stepped into the office. He held his hat in his hands, not quite crushing the brim. Marla felt the air change when he came in. He wasn't the type to linger under fluorescent light. "Could you print me a copy of all my tickets from this month?" he asked, voice low. He didn't look angry. He looked tired clear through. She glanced toward the owner's door, half shut. "I'm not really supposed to—" Her words trailed off as she met his eyes. There was no threat there, just a steady weight that made excuses feel cheap. "I can run them after close. They'll just think it's my own records." That night, as the last truck rumbled away, Marla fed the system a string of numbers and pulled a longer report than usual. The printer chattered, spitting out a list of dates, lot numbers, and weights. She slid the stack into a folder and walked it to the shadowed dock where Elias waited by his pickup. He laid those fresh tickets next to his worn notebook on the tailgate. Pencil marks from past seasons lined up with neat printed rows. He traced a finger down one column, then circled a weight that was 10 pounds light. Beside it, in his notebook, he had written, "Full wagon, dry, should be 1400. It wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern. Behind the warehouse, crickets sawed in the weeds. Diesel smell hung over the gravel. Elias turned page after page, his jaw tightening. Marla stood a few feet away, arms folded against the night air, watching him compare his truth to the machine's story. "You think the machine's wrong?" she asked. "The man running it is," he said. In that moment, a narrow door cracked open in his mind. The scale wasn't just some magic box. It was a tool someone could bend, and tools left marks. If he could track those marks, he could prove what his gut already screamed. Clay wasn't only using his curing method, he was tilting the numbers that set prices for it. The next morning, Elias drove to the sheriff's office with a few circled tickets in his shirt pocket. Sheriff Boyd Granger listened, leaned back, and rubbed his temple. "You're saying the warehouse is shaving a little off your loads," Boyd said. "That's hard to prove, Eli. Those machines got calibrations, shrink, who knows? And even if we did prove it, that's civil, mostly. Not my lane unless there's clear theft." Elias left with a polite nod and a heavier step. To him, it was clear as sunrise. If a man took pounds off your leaf and sold your fire tricks as his own, he was stealing straight out of your blood. To the sheriff, it sounded like a business dispute about weights and measures. Back at the farm, Ruth urged him to write someone higher. "There's an office in Riley. Send copies. Make them look." Elias stared at the papers on the table. He pictured a clean desk far away, some stranger shrugging at his neat circles and saying, "Machines glitch." That night, he sat alone in the barn, lantern low, notebook open. He drew a box on the page and wrote 3 words inside it: Clay, scales, fire. Underneath, in smaller script, he added, "If law won't see, I will."
It wasn't a vow spoken aloud. It was a hard line on paper, drawn by a man who felt law had no room for the thing that made his family who they were. The choice he made right there was his misstep and his plan in one. He would keep gathering proof, not for court, so no one could say he'd imagined the slight. At the same time, he started mapping something darker in his head. Barns, roads, men. Evidence and anger grew side by side in that notebook, sharing the same thin paper.
From the night he drew that hard box in his notebook, Elias stopped hoping someone else would fix things. 2 days later, he bought a small plastic cassette recorder from the discount bin at Pike's Hardware, paid cash, and left without a word. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, learning the feel of the red button, the sound of the tiny wheels starting and stopping. Pencil and paper could be dismissed. A human voice caught on tape felt harder for any court or company man to ignore. Next morning, he slid the recorder into his jacket and drove a loaded truck to the warehouse. The dock shook with engines and shouted numbers. Clay lounged near the shiny new scalehead, laughing with a buyer from the co-op. When Elias's wagon rolled onto the platform, the glowing numbers jumped high, then dipped 3 pounds the instant Clay's knuckle brushed a small gray panel. Elias stepped down, boots ringing on metal. He watched the screen steady on the lower figure. "It read heavier when I came on," he said. Clay's smile did not move. "These rigs drift till they warm up. You'll win a few, lose a few. Trust me, it evens out." Men along the concrete wall went quiet. Marla, behind office glass, saw the look in Elias's eyes and heard the printer jerk awake. The ticket that spit out did not match the number she'd seen a blink before. As she tore it free, Clay leaned closer to Elias, dropping his voice, but not enough. "If it favors you next load, I won't hear you fuss, will I?" he said. The tone stayed easy, yet the meaning was clear as a slap. The machine could lean, and he chose where. Inside Elias's pocket, the recorder hummed, catching every syllable under the grind of gears. He signed, tucked the slip with his notebook, and drove off without another word. Instead of turning toward home, he kept going until pavement turned to sand and pines pressed close on both sides. A narrow fire lane opened to the right. He pulled in, shut off the engine, and let the heat and cicadas fill the cab. Only then did he take out the recorder. He rewound by feel until the wheels clicked, then pressed play. Clay's laugh fizzed through the tiny speaker, followed by the wait call, talk of drift, and that soft promise about being favored. Out on the noisy dock, it might have sounded like another joke. In the stillness of that pine stand, it sounded like a man admitting the game was rigged. He played the line again, staring through the dusty glass at nothing. The tape did not speak of stolen curing tricks or barns full of his red color, but it nailed down what the sheriff had called hard to prove. Here was proof, thin and hiss-lined, that a neighbor treated the scale like a level, not a level. He popped the cassette out, wrote the date and scale talk on its blank label, and slid it into a plain envelope from the glove box. That envelope went under the floor mat by his heel. Beside his ledgers of weights and weather, he now had a different kind of record, one made of moving sound instead of pencil marks. From that hour, his anger stopped wandering. It settled into tasks. Gather, mark, plan. Back in town, the story spread in usual crooked lines. At the gas pumps and cafe booths, men said Elias had got touchy about a normal short load, or that Clay had tried to help and been snapped at. No one mentioned the quiet click in a worn jacket pocket. For you listening now, that is the first real divide. On porches, folks traded a loose tale about a fussy farmer. In a truck hidden among scrub pines, a tape waited that would, years later, play back in a bright forensic lab and show that someone had been tilting more than numbers. That tape under the floor mat was only the first thing Elias set aside for the day he knew was coming. He drove back onto the highway, face blank, thoughts busy, and by sundown, his truck sat again in the yard where the Cole house leaned against red sand and long shadow. Ruth watched him climb out, slow, like every step weighed more than it had that morning. He said almost nothing over supper. Jacob and Tommy traded glances and kept quiet too. A few days later, word about his dust-up at the scales floated down to Latimer's feed, where old Mr. Wade Latimer stacked sacks slower than he used to. He was past 70, thin as a tobacco stick, but his mind stayed sharp as a new blade. He'd seen more than one man lose land to slick talk and crooked paper. When Elias pulled in for fuel, Latimer wiped his hands and met him by the pump. "Heard you and Clay had words," Latimer said, leaning on the fender while the pump clicked. Elias just watched the numbers spin, jaw tight. "Scales got minds of their own now with all them wires," the old man went on. "But wires don't move unless a hand tells them to. You watch his hand?" Later that evening, the two of them sat on Latimer's porch, boards soft under their boots, as dusk settled over a yard full of rusting equipment and half-mowed weeds. Cicadas sang, and the old man told a story Elias already half knew. Years back, a buyer had shaved his weights and shorted him near enough to cost the farm. He'd hired a lawyer in town, filed papers, and watched the case die slow under fees he couldn't keep paying. "I wanted to bust his nose," Latimer said, staring past the road. "Didn't. Would have lost more than money if I had." Elias listened, fingers laced, the tape of Clay's soft brag still running in his mind. "You didn't let the law do it." "No, reckon it didn't," Latimer answered. "But I'm here. Farm ain't what it was, though it's still mine on paper. My boy got to be a nurse in town, not a convict somewhere. There's things you don't fix with a gun, Eli." He shuffled back inside and came out with a wrinkled business card, an old cousin's name from Raleigh printed in fading ink. "He works where they watch the markets, knows about weights, contracts, all that mess. You feel cheated, you send him what you circled. Let somebody outside this county see." Elias took the card, rough thumbs sliding over raised letters. He tucked it behind his notebook cover like a thin door he might still walk through. 2 weeks later, before Elias made up his mind about using that card, word rolled through the gas station lot that Wade Latimer had dropped in his yard. No warning, no long illness, just a hot afternoon, a push mower, and a stroke that laid him down between two bare spots of dirt. Elias heard it from a clerk while he paid for fuel. The news landed like a board across his chest. At the funeral, fans stirred thick air in the little church, and men muttered about how the good ones always seemed to go first. Elias stood by the grave, hat in his hands, knowing the last elder who told him to step back from the edge was now under red clay. That night, at his own table, Ruth slid the Raleigh card across the wood toward him. Instead of writing, he circled more tickets. That night, at the kitchen table, the Raleigh card stayed between Elias and Ruth like a small, unused bridge. He saw her watching his hand, hoping he'd pick it up and write, but the pencil kept coming back to the same job, circles around numbers that didn't match, arrows from his notes to the printed weights. When he finally closed the notebook, the card was still there, its edges bending where his thumb had pressed without meaning to. Sunday brought the different kind of pressure. After church, in the gravel lot, Elias stood by the truck while families lingered under pine shade. Laughter rose near Clay's car. His cousins and hired hands clustered around him, their shirts new, their wives and girlfriends in bright dresses. Someone slapped him on the back and called him the man with the magic barns. A little boy on a tricycle rolled circles near their feet. Elias watched that circle of men and saw more than smiles. He saw mortgage papers he didn't own, supper tables full because of work tied to his stolen fire. If he struck at those men, the hurt would spread past them to those small faces in the dust. Later that week, the local paper ran a short piece on the new scientific curing that some growers were using. The narrator, speaking from years ahead, can tell you what that clipping looked like: a grainy photo of Clay in front of a barn door, headline bragging about local innovators boosting tobacco quality. There was no mention of the quiet man whose father had scratched notes into old barn boards long before anyone printed the word innovation over red leaf. That clipping, folded and faded, would turn up in a box of exhibits decades later, a small square of proof that the county had cheered the man who'd crossed the code. In 1985, it landed on the Cole porch with all the other news. Jacob read the story aloud, then looked up to find his father already gone from the room. By late summer, Clay's teaching had spread down sandy lanes Elias knew like scars. Cousins on one road, in-laws on another, Even a young man who'd once worked for the Coles, now hanging leaf in a Pike barn. The same color showed in more and more doorways. Men who used to ask Elias for advice stopped dropping by, too ashamed or too proud to face him. Inside the sheriff's squad room, a county map hung on corkboard, pushpins marking break-ins, wrecks, and petty fights. Some evenings, Sheriff Granger sat there with coffee and listened to half-formed complaints about money and work. "Pike's paying better than anyone," one grower told him. "He's figured something." Granger nodded, thinking mostly about keeping peace, not about how that something had been taken. At home, Elias tacked his own map to the wall of a back room. It was just a feed store handout, roads printed in thin black lines. With a red pen, he marked each farm where he knew Clay's method had taken root. One dot for cousins, another for in-laws, a cluster where a whole stretch of kin had switched sides. He stared at that pattern until it stopped being a set of neighbors and turned into a target laid over land. Marla saw a different pattern from her chair by the ticket printer. As weeks passed, she fed the machine names and watched the same ones roll out with neat, generous weights. Others, Elias among them, came in light in ways that didn't fit what she'd seen on the dock. She started keeping her own small stack of copies, tucked behind a drawer insert. It wasn't loyalty to him that pushed her, not at first. It was a growing unease at how the numbers bent whenever Clay lingered by the control room door. Doubt worked on Elias in two directions. On one side, it whispered that maybe he could still mail those circled tickets and tapes to Raleigh, let someone far away decide. On the other, it hissed that no stranger would ever grasp what it meant to see your family's work hanging under another man's name. Each time Elias watched Clay drive past in a clean truck, windows down, kids in the back seat, the second voice grew louder. He knew that if he went after Clay alone, the lie would live on in every barn already burning his fire. If he went after everyone, he'd be swinging at men whose kids played in front of the same church where his own had once carried bulletins. Standing between that map on his wall and the Raleigh card curling on the table, Elias felt the last of the middle ground crumble.
Between the map on the wall and the curled Raleigh card, Elias stood very still. One path meant letters, waiting, and men in suits who might shrug at his pain. The other meant blood. He reached for his notebook, not the card. That choice set the shape of everything that followed. On the kitchen table, he laid out what he'd gathered so far. Circled tickets, Marla's long printout, pages from his ledgers with arrows and dates, the cassette with Clay's soft talk about drift. One by one, he stacked them in order, like sticks in a firebox. Ruth watched from the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. "You're not mailing those, are you?" she asked. He shook his head once. "They're for later," he said. She did not ask what later meant. In the back bedroom, he cleared a space on the bedspread and set down a box of blank envelopes. His handwriting, slow and square, spelled out two names: Sheriff Boyd Granger, Hoke County, and North Carolina Department of Agriculture, attention, weights and measures. Inside each, he placed copies of tickets, a short letter, and a tape. The letters used plain words. "My neighbor Randall Claiborne Pike stole my curing method and rigged the electronic scale at the warehouse." No talk of honor, just facts he knew could be checked. A metal ammo box came down from the closet shelf next. It had dark streaks of old oil on the lid. Elias wiped it with his sleeve, then lined it with plastic and laid in extra copies of the same things. One more cassette, one more map with red dots, one more list of names and barns. He closed the latch and spun the handle, listening to the seal bite. Out in the shed, the smell of gun oil and mouse droppings mixed in the close air. Jacob and Tommy stood by the workbench while their father slid bolt-action rifles from old sleeves. "Season's coming, need these clean." The boys ran rags down barrels and checked sights, thinking of deer and maybe a fox. Elias thought of men under tin roofs, of field roads he could drive blind, of how far a round carried in open land. He did not speak of targets, he spoke of tasks. "Light oil, no extra, wipe what you spill," he said. The steady tone kept his hands from shaking. Each rifle went back into its sleeve, laid where he could grab fast. A cardboard box of shells slid under the truck seat later that night, beside a second envelope marked only Jacob in firm black letters.
When the house was quiet, Elias took a shovel and the ammo box to a spot under an old chinaberry tree near the lane. The soil gave easy under metal, soft from years of roots and rain. He lowered the box into the hole, dirt cool on his wrists, and covered it until only a faint flat place showed. A heavy stone on top made a marker only he and, one day, an investigator would see as out of place. Across the state, years in the future, that same box would sit open on a gray steel table in an SBI evidence room. Latex gloves would flip through warped tickets and pull out the tape marked Scale Talk. A flat-screen monitor would glow with scanned images of his map. What Elias scratched in pencil under a barn light would become colored lines in a computer program, each red dot on his feed store map matching a farm where someone died. Back in 1985, the only light came from a single bulb over the kitchen sink. Elias stood there rinsing dirt from his hands, the Rowley card now pinned by the salt shaker. Ruth dried a plate and finally asked, "Are you going to do something we can't come back from?" He answered with silence, the kind that says more than words. Upstairs, floorboards creaked as Jacob moved, restless, sensing a storm he could not name. Before lying down, Elias laid his work shirt, cap, and boots in a neat line by the bedroom door. Beside them he placed one envelope for the sheriff, ready to ride in the truck seat, and another for Jacob, to be found if he did not come home. Outside, dogs barked far off, night insects buzzed, and a faint hum from the warehouse town drifted on the air. Dawn was only a gray smear on the edge of the sky when he rose. Trucks would soon roll toward the red brick building where all that season's labor turned into numbers. He picked up his keys, the tape-heavy coat, and the first envelope. In the next part, we'll follow him onto that dock and watch how a plan built from paper and sound walked hand in hand with a loaded gun. By mid-morning, that gray smear of dawn had hardened into bright light over sirens and dust. The first call to the sheriff's office came from a trembling warehouse hand who kept repeating the same words. "He's shooting him, Sheriff. He's shooting everybody." The dispatcher wrote "gunfire at warehouse" on a pad already stained with coffee and called Boyd Granger on his car radio. On the county road past the pine scrub, Boyd hit his lights and pushed the cruiser faster. Gravel spit under tires as he turned into the warehouse lot. Trucks, wagons, and men's hats lay scattered like a storm had picked them up and dropped them wrong. The sharp smell of gunpowder mixed with the sweet of busted leaf. Near the loading dock, 3 bodies lay in a loose line. One hand still clutched a folded ticket, another lay half under a wagon wheel. Blood made dark puddles on the concrete, already drawing flies. Boyd's deputies moved in slow, guns out, calling, "Sheriff's office, if you can hear me, shout." Only groans answered. Marla stood just inside the office door, white as the paper on her desk. Her printer still held a half-finished report, the last weight run before the first shot. When Boyd stepped past her, she pointed at the scale head, its numbers frozen in mid-cycle, and then toward the far end of the dock. "It was Elias. He walked right past me. He left something on the counter." Beside the digital scale sat a stained notebook and a small cassette recorder, its red light off. A folded envelope lay under the edge of the pad, addressed in block letters, "Sheriff Boyd Granger." Boyd slid it into his pocket without opening it, eyes still moving over the chaos out back. Another call crackled over the radio before he could finish securing the scene. Shots reported on Sand Track Road, then again near Pike's upper barn. The words "man down" and "possible multiple" blurred together. This wasn't one angry outburst at the dock, it was a chain. At the first road scene, a dusty sedan sat half in a drainage ditch, driver's door open. A young farmhand lay face down in the weeds, back torn by pellets. Tobacco leaves were scattered across the shoulder, torn from bundles that had flown when he jerked the wheel. A child's drawing fluttered out of the glove box, caught in the grass by a twig. Deputy Mason took photos, the old 35mm clicking steady. Chalk marks went down. Boyd bent to look at the man's cap, a Pike farm patch sewn on the front. "That's Darrell Pike's boy, Clay's cousin." Boyd grunted, more of a sound of knowledge than surprise. More reports came in, another body at the edge of a field road, 2 men down by a barn with fresh red hanging in the doorway. Each time when names came back, they tied to the same ring of farms Elias had marked weeks earlier with his red pen. Cousins, hired hands, buyer's helpers, all of them working under Clay's taught method. Back at the warehouse, once the wounded were loaded and the dead covered, Boyd finally opened the envelope Elias had left. Inside lay 3 circled tickets, a short note, and a cassette marked Scale Talk, Clay. The note was only a few sentences. It spoke of stolen fire, rigged weights, and no law for a man's hard work. It listed 6 names, some already lying still on cold ground. While deputies roped off areas with yellow tape, Ruth Cole sat on her front porch, hands flat on her knees, watching a cruiser raise dust up the lane. She knew, before the door shut and Boyd stepped out, that her husband had done what he'd been drifting toward. Inside the house, another envelope waited on the kitchen table with Jacob's name and a smaller pile of copied tickets under a coffee cup. One of the crime scene techs years later would flip through the photos taken that day and notice how often tobacco leaves showed near the bodies, in a ditch, by a barn, on a dock. The dead were all tied, not just by blood and work, but by a certain color of leaf and a set of contracts no camera could see. In the present, though, the sheriff saw only a map in his mind filling with pins, warehouse, sand track, pike barns. The pattern that Elias had drawn in private now began to sketch itself in police reports and radio logs. When SBI agents arrived that afternoon, they bagged the notebook and both tape recorders, the one from the scale and the one found in Elias's truck. They didn't yet know that those small rectangles of plastic and spooled tape would decades later sit under digital lenses and analysis software. They only knew that a quiet man had turned his county into a trail of bodies and that he'd left a paper and sound record that said, in his own hard way, "This is why." In a low motel off Highway 1, the state set up its brain. The pool was closed for the season, but the conference room lights burned late. Card tables held maps, manila folders, cold coffee, and a gray computer brought in from the regional office. This was where strangers would try to make sense of what the Sandhills already knew in its bones. Agent Denise Holloway stood at the wall map first. Red pins marked where the bodies lay. Warehouse, Sand Track Road, Pike's Lower Barn, a narrow lane by a tin shed. Lines of string linked them back to one name written in black at the center, Elias Morgan Cole. She traced those strings with a finger, then added smaller blue pins for the victims' homes and work sites. Almost every blue pin carried the word Pike in the margin. On another table, a tech from the warehouse company eased floppy disks into the waiting drive. The machine whirred and beeped, drawing up lists of weights, dates, and user codes in pale green letters. Denise watched as the tech printed out rows of numbers, each line a load of leaf someone had sweated over. "Here's where Pike logs in before opening," he said, tapping a code, RCP. "Here's when the baseline gets nudged." Once the printouts cooled, she laid them beside Marla Jessup's secret stack of copied tickets. A yellow highlighter made quick work of the worst spots. Lots from Clay's cousins showed sudden gains over a few weeks. Loads from Elias dropped by small, steady bits. The pattern looked like a sawtooth, rising for one set of names, dipping for another. In another corner, a young SBI agent listened through headphones to the tape Elias had left at the scale. Clay's recorded voice floated out into the room through tinny monitor speakers. Talk of drift and favor sounded casual, almost lazy, but the timing matched the exact seconds the weight had changed on the screen. Denise made a note, admits human handling of scale output in context of complaint. Sheriff Granger sat in a folding chair as they went through it. He saw his own world laid out in lines and codes that stripped faces away. When Denise asked who each victim had been to the town, he gave short answers. Daryl Pike's boy, hired on last year, learned curing out at Clay's. That one there worked the new barns, stayed loyal after Elias got sore. With each link, the picture sharpened. Elias had not picked random names. He had traced the chain of his stolen method and followed it with a gun. Yet the papers on Denise's table told a story with 2 crimes, not one. One crime sat in the open now in body bags and blood. The other lay in shifts of digits, in hand-drawn circles on faded tickets. She wrote in the margin of her report, "Motivation appears tied to long-term economic and cultural harm, craft theft and fraud, rather than simple quarrel."
From the narrator's high perch, we can see how rare that line was in cases like this. Most files marked men like Elias with words like jealous, unstable, explosive. Denise reached for something harder to place in a form. Fear that a lifetime of work could be erased by one neighbor with charm and a password. In the days that followed, interviews filled thick tape reels on a separate machine. Marla told how she'd seen numbers flicker on the scale head. Other farmers spoke, some careful, some bitter, about a sense that Pike's folks always came out heavy. A few admitted they'd noticed Clay's barns glowing red faster than made sense. None of it excused what Elias had done, but it wrapped that violence in context the jury would later be forced to hear. By the end of the week, the motel room looked less like a crime scene hub and more like an accounting office hit by a windstorm. Charts, tickets, and copies of Elias's barn notebooks covered every flat space. Denise stepped back and tried to state it plain in her notes. Subject Cole constructed personal evidence trail, ledgers, tapes, mapped farms, to prove fraud and theft of proprietary curing method, then used that same map to select homicide targets. If you follow true crime long enough, you know this is where stories often split. One track runs with the killings and the shock. The other runs with the slow, dry work of logs and reports. Here, the two tracks locked together. Elias's own habit of writing and recording handed the state both a motive and a path of premeditation. His tech countermeasure, built to defend his legacy, now helped define the case that would cage him.
On the Sunday after the first wave of interviews, the fellowship hall filled with folding tables and dishes that sweated under clear plastic wrap. Churchwomen laid out hams, deviled eggs, and pound cake like food might soak up shock. Men carried metal chairs, their boots loud on the tile. Children were told to play outside. In that bright room, grief and anger had to share space. Widows of the dead farmhands sat near the back wall, paper plates untouched in front of them. A few feet away, older farmers leaned close over coffee, their voices low. At the far table, Pastor Green tried to keep small talk going and failed. Whispers about the tapes and the tickets had already slipped out of the sheriff's office. Somebody's cousin knew a deputy, somebody else had a niece who typed for the county attorney. By Sunday, the story sounded like this. The state had proof that Clay's fancy machine was never as honest as he claimed. For some, that detail landed like a small kind of justice. Old men who had spent years squinting at hand scales felt less crazy. Knew those numbers smelled wrong, one said, fingers tight around a styrofoam cup. Others heard about the rigged readings and only grew more bitter. Their sons were still in the ground. May Ellen Parker, whose husband had died in the ditch off Sandtrack Road, pushed her plate away when she heard an older farmer say Elias did what courts won't. Her voice cut across the room. My Joe didn't steal anything. He worked where there was work. That man shot him like a dog. Across from her, a gray-haired deacon shook his head. He had no kin in the ground, but he carried his own stack of grudges against far-off offices. System failed him, failed all of us. Man's recipe gets lifted, scales get played with, nobody in Raleigh cares till bullets fly. His words did not comfort May Ellen. At another table, Jacob and Tommy sat with paper cups of sweet tea, listening to people talk about their father as if he were already dead. Some called Elias crazy, some called him hard. A few said he'd been quiet his whole life and then just snapped. The boys knew better. Nothing about the last months had been sudden. Pastor Green finally tapped his fork against a glass. The room settled a little. He spoke about sin and pain, about how two wrongs never make two rights. Then he said something that stayed with more than one listener. We can condemn what Elias did without pretending he didn't have a reason. That line split the hall even more. From the narrator's place in the future, it is easy to see that sentence as a hinge. Some folks walked out angry, feeling like the church had taken the killer's side. Others left thinking about recipes and scales and promises made in barns their own fathers had once worked. The code of the county was arguing with the law right there under fluorescent lights. Out in the gravel lot afterwards, the talk turned harsher.
A younger man whose cousin had died near Pike's barn spat in the dust and said, "You all keep yammering about scales. He still aimed at people, not metal." An older woman, kin to Elias through marriage, answered that Clay had aimed first, only his weapon had been numbers and contracts. Neither would yield. From that day, tales about Elias's tapes and tickets spread, bending raw facts into the county's lasting memory and judgment. As stories about scales and secrets spread through kitchens and store porches, one set of papers sat quiet but sure in a metal drawer at the county jail. That stack held the dry facts of power turned on its head, the booking sheet from the day Elias Cole gave himself up. 2 days after the massacre, he walked through town with no coat and no gun. Morning sun hit the broken window of Pike's Hardware as he passed. Folks on the sidewalk went still, watching the man they now called a monster move like someone going to pay a light bill. He turned in at the low brick building marked Sheriff. Sheriff Granger met him just inside. The smell of coffee and old floor wax hung in the narrow hall. Boyd's hand rested near his holster, though he did not draw. "You here to finish what you started?" he asked. Elias shook his head. "I'm here to end it," he said. "You won't have to chase me." In the booking room, a deputy read from a worn form. Name, address, date of birth. The list of charges stretched longer than the blanks on the page. 15 counts of murder, more for assault and use of a weapon. When the deputy faltered, Boyd took the pen and filled the spaces himself. A property tray held what Elias had brought: pocket knife, coins, folded tickets, and one more envelope with Boyd's name. The sheriff opened this one. Inside lay another cassette marked Scale Talk Copy, and a short note: "Same as before, keep with the first." Boyd passed both tape and paper to an SBI agent who had driven in for the surrender. Fingerprints smudged black ink across Elias's hands. A camera flashed, catching a tired face and eyes that did not hunt for escape routes. The intake form, later scanned into a state database, recorded his answer when asked about health. "Fine enough," he said. "Just tired." Under mental state, the nurse wrote, "Alert, oriented, no signs of confusion." From the narrator's higher view, that form stands as the state's first official picture of him after the blood. Not raving, not drunk. Just a man who had made up his mind and walked into his own cage, carrying the same tools he'd used to build his case: paper and tape. Jacob sat on a hard bench in the hallway, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He watched deputies move past with boxes of evidence from the farm: ledgers, maps, another small recorder from under a truck seat. One deputy carried the ammo box they dug from under the chinaberry tree. Mud still clung to the hinges. Ruth did not come inside. She waited in the car, hands wrapped around the windshield, watching rain streak slowly down the windshield. When Boyd stepped out later to tell her the judge had agreed to hold Elias without bond, she only asked one thing: "Did he say why?" Boyd thought of the envelope in his desk. "He said the record will show it," he answered. Down the hall, Denise Holloway signed the chain of custody forms for each new tape and notebook. Each item passed from local hands to state ones, bore her initials and the date. Those simple letters, D.H., tied Elias's tech trail to the wider machine of law. Whatever the county believed, those tapes were now locked into an official story. If you're still with me, and these layers of law and local code have you thinking, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss how the trial plays this out. Because what came next was a courtroom where those same tapes that proved fraud also proved planning. Jacob led Elias down a short hall to a narrow cell. Metal clanged as the door shut. For the first time in weeks, there were no barns, no maps, no cards from Raleigh in sight, only cinder-block walls and a thin mattress. Yet even there, his plan kept moving without him. The evidence he made, tickets, notes, recordings, continued walking through offices and labs, carrying his reason into rooms he would never see. In the days that followed, lawyers and agents moved around his name like ants on a dropped crumb. The man himself stayed put, saying little, eating when trays came, sleeping when the lights dimmed. Outside, the town argued over his soul. Inside, the system took hold of his deeds, ready to weigh them in a different kind of scale.
Months after he walked into his own cage, Elias stood in a suit that didn't fit right at the defense table of the Hope County Courthouse. The room smelled of polish and sweat. Ceiling fans turned slow overhead. Oak benches groaned under the weight of neighbors, widows, and reporters who'd driven in from Raleigh and Charlotte to see how a farm feud had turned into state headlines. At the front, the judge's black robe hung loose on a narrow frame. 12 jurors sat straight, eyes fixed on the man who had once fixed their fences and now faced 15 counts of murder. Behind him, Jacob and Ruth sat close, her hand on their son's arm. A few rows over, May Ellen Parker clutched a folded tissue until it tore. The state went first. The district attorney, a man from the city with a smooth voice, waved at a stack of binders. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is not a case about tobacco tricks. This is about a man who planned, mapped, and executed killings across this county." He pointed at a blown-up chart, the same map Agent Holloway had built in the motel, now mounted on foam board, red dots bright under the lights. Agent Denise Holloway took the stand and walked the jury through that map. She used simple terms. "Each dot is a crime scene," she said. "Each line leads back to Mr. Cole's own notes." She held up his barn notebooks, his ledger pages, the hand-drawn farm map. Then she nodded to the tech by the evidence cart. The courtroom speakers crackled as Clay Pike's recorded voice filled the air. Jurors heard the hum of the warehouse, Elias's low complaint about a number dropping, and Clay's easy reply about drift and being favored later. Some in the gallery shifted in their seats. May Ellen stared straight ahead, jaw set. Ruth let her eyes close for one heartbeat when she heard Clay's laugh. On a screen wheeled in from the clerk's office, the prosecutor showed copies of the warehouse computer logs. Colored marks highlighted the mornings when the base weight had been changed under Clay's code. Side by side with Marla's copied tickets and Elias's circled notes, the pattern glowed as clear as the bulbs overhead. "He was right about the cheating," the prosecutor said. Then he turned, pointed at Elias, and added, "But being right does not give you the right to kill." The defense did not try to say Elias hadn't pulled the trigger. His lawyer, a tired man with a cheap briefcase and sharp eyes, told the jury that up front. "We won't insult you by suggesting otherwise," he said. "What we will show you is why a quiet farmer came to believe no one in Raleigh or here would protect what little his family had left." He called Marla first. She told the jury about flickering numbers, about Clay in the control room before dawn, about her own hidden stack of tickets. He called an investigator from the Agriculture Department who testified that after the killings, state regulators had cited the warehouse for improper calibration and record-keeping. A fine had been paid, policies had been updated. Then he brought in older farmers who spoke, sometimes with shaking voices, about feeling shorted by the new, honest machine. One said he sold land when checks came light year after year. Another admitted he'd thought about doing something stupid when he watched Clay's barns go red. Last came a prison counselor who'd met with Elias after his arrest. She spoke of war memories, of a man who carried quiet rage and bone-deep fear of erasure. She believed, she said, that when his curing method was taken and his weights were shaved, his family name was being erased from the soil. The prosecutor pushed back hard. On cross-examination, he held up the same notebooks the defense had used. "These aren't the scribbles of a confused man," he said. "These are plans, targets. He knew what he was doing, and he chose murder over every other option." Juror notes taken that day, later copied into the file, show the split in their minds. Beside guilt, one juror wrote clear. Beside death, the same juror wrote, "But why scales? Why recipe?" In the jury room, they argued late about punishment. Some wanted the needle. Others, raised under the same code that shaped Elias, could not vote to kill a man who walked in on his own and whose grievance the state itself had partly proved. In the end, they came back with a hard middle. Guilty on all 15 counts of first-degree murder, no recommendation for death.
The judge sentenced Elias to multiple life terms, some stacked, making it plain he would die behind bars. In a softer voice, the judge read a note into the record. The court recognized serious misconduct in the warehouse's scale practices and urged regulators to finish their own work. Clay Pike's name could not go on any indictment. His grave already held him. But in that courtroom, on that day, the official story tied him forever to fraud and to the fire he had helped light. Elias heard the sentence without flinching. His tech trail did two things at once. It proved the theft he could not live with, and it locked him in a cell for the way he chose to answer it.
When the judge's words faded, a deputy touched Elias's elbow and led him through a side door. The roar of the courtroom dropped away, replaced by the close sound of shoes on a narrow hall. A holding cell waited at the end, bars dull from many hands. The door shut with a flat clang. That was the first gate. More gates followed. Chain link, steel, thick doors with little windows. A bus carried him east to a state prison built of poured concrete and razor wire. Numbers took the place of fields. His name still sat on file folders and evidence boxes, but on the yard sheet, he was just another inmate in gray. Morning whistles took the place of rooster calls. Elias woke on a thin mattress, folded blankets tight, and stood for count when guards walked past. He swept, he mopped, and took a job in the prison laundry, where hot air and steam felt almost like the curing barn, minus the sweet leaf smell. At night, he lay on his bunk and listened to other men talk about cars, robberies, pieces of lives they had broken. Mail came in small stacks. A letter from Ruth at first, written slow in blue ink, told him the bank had taken one of the back fields. "We kept the house and main barn," she wrote. "Jacob's trying to hold what he can." She did not write about town talk. She did not have to. He knew. Jacob's letters carried more edge. He wrote about patching roofs, about buyers who came less each year, about hearing the word coal in whispers when he walked into the co-op. In one note, he said, "They find the warehouse, Daddy. Paper in Raleigh says they cheated folks. Your tapes did that." The clipping he folded inside showed a short article, "State cites Hulk Warehouse for scale violations." Seeing those words, Elias felt something twist in his chest. The record he'd built had reached the people who weighed rules. The state had written wrong beside the same acts he'd circled under a barn light. Yet the fine was small. No one went to a cell for what they'd done with numbers. Only he went for what he'd done with a gun. Ruth's hand grew shakier over time. Then, one winter, the letters stopped altogether. A chaplain came to the block one day with a sad set to his mouth and a note from Jacob. "Mama's gone. Heart. We put her up near Grandpa on the hill. I told him you'd want that." In his bunk that night, Elias lay still, eyes open, feeling the full cost of each choice he'd made. The woman who had stood in the barn doorway, watching smoke and suns, would never see him free. Years folded into each other. Hair thinned, hands that once tied leaf grew spotted. Prison rules never changed much. Keep your head down, don't owe, don't show fear. Elias followed those with the same stubborn care he'd once given his fireboxes. Guards called him quiet, cellmates called him old man, and some younger convicts came to him for calm advice when fights brewed. Legacy found a strange new shape there. On a gray afternoon, Agent Denise Holloway came to the visiting room. Plexiglass and metal stools separated them. A guard set a tape on the counter between phones. "We're moving your materials to state archives," she said. "Part of a bigger review on farm fraud. Need your signature to release copies." Her voice stayed even. She wasn't there to comfort. She was there to close loops. He read the form slowly, tracing the lines with a calloused finger. Signing meant his tapes, maps, and ledgers could be studied, digitized, and one day played for people who had never seen a curing barn. After a long pause, he picked up the pen. The scrawl he left was rough but clear. Whatever else had happened, he still wanted the truth about the theft to stand where no one could bury it. Some visits came with softer weight. Jacob brought his little girl once,
feet barely reaching the floor of the plastic chair. She studied her grandfather through the glass with wide eyes. "He's the one who wrote all those books," Jacob told her later, meaning the notebooks hidden at home, not the blood, not yet. He's the one who figured out how to make the leaf that red. One year, Jacob arrived alone and slid a note against the glass for Elias to see. "Recipes safe," it said. In the letter that followed, he explained. He'd found the tin box under the chinaberry, dug it up after a storm washed soil aside. Inside was the old curing notebook, wrapped in oilcloth, edges stiff. He had not used the method in full. He had not burned it either. Instead, he'd sealed it back, this time in a better box, tucked into the attic of a small house he now rented in town. In that cramped cell, Elias sat with the letter in his hands. The tech trail he'd built had kept his grievance from being washed out of the record. The recipe still existed, not on screen, but on paper his father's knife had once dotted with sweat. Yet everything around those facts had been scorched. Wife gone, land mostly gone, 15 graves that carried his shadow. Most nights he lay back and stared at the ceiling, replaying not the gunshots, but the mornings before them, the card from Raleigh he never used, the old man on the porch warning him about weight you can't lay down. Legacy, in the end, was still there. It just sat now inside a box no one quite dared open, bearing a name that half the county proud and half the county sick.
10 years after the shootings, rain hit the thin metal roof of May Ellen Parker's trailer while the local news played. Her couch sagged, the carpet was worn, and a small television glowed in the corner. The anchor's bright smile did not match his words as he read a short piece on the Cole Farm Massacre. Old footage showed the warehouse dock, sheriff's cars, and a mugshot of Elias in orange. At the bottom of the screen, one word ran in red: Rampage. May Ellen sat forward, elbows on her knees. To the newscast, Elias was just a crazed killer. No one mentioned the warehouse scale logs or the tickets she'd once seen crumpled in her husband's truck. Her oldest son, Danny, leaned in the kitchen doorway, jaw tight. He had grown up without the father who used to haul for Pike. Numbers on paper meant little beside the empty chair across from him at supper and the stack of unpaid bills by the ashtray. Across the county, other houses looked much the same. Widows worked long shifts or remarried. Some moved north to factories. Children stared at photos of men in work shirts who never got old. At school, teachers spoke carefully about the massacre during units on law. In one class, a girl named Lacey, kin to Elias through Ruth, read an essay about barns and fire without using her last name. A boy asked if her people were the killers or the ones killed. She had no answer. Jacob carried a different burden. After Ruth died, he tried to keep the last Cole acres going, planting more than he knew he could comfortably tend. Prices slid, fuel climbed, and some neighbors refused to work his fields, saying they couldn't take Cole money. Others came because there were no better options. At the bank, the loan officer saw more than numbers on a form. He saw headlines, a courtroom sketch, and a surname that still divided the church aisle. Tommy chose not to stay. Restless and angry, he enlisted and left the Sandhills for bases and deserts he'd only seen in training films. In rare letters home, he wrote more about sandstorms and rations than about feelings. Under the neat lines, though, Jacob could read a mix of pride and shame. His brother wore one uniform while their father wore another, marked not by rank but by a DOC number stitched under his name. Marla's life narrowed in quieter ways. She stayed at the warehouse office until it closed for good, the once new electronic scale pushed into a dusty corner. Later, she rang up groceries in town, head down, smile small. In the back of her bedroom closet, a cardboard box sat on the floor marked Cole/Pike. Inside lay her secret stack of copied tickets, a cassette she dubbed from Elias's tape, and a faded clipping about the state fine for bad scale practices. One evening, a cable show aired a fast segment on forgotten rural tragedies using that same easy word, rampage. Marla shut off the set and sat in the dark. Families on every side were still living with graves, lost chances, and old anger, yet the screen had room only for a headline and a mugshot. In her closet, paper and plastic held a slower truth: that cheating and stolen craft walked before the gun. The tech trail slept, waiting for someone willing to open the box and listen close. For now, the families carried the weight, while the evidence gathered dust in the dark. No one guessed it would ever speak. By the time 20 years had passed, the Carolina Sandhills did not look the same. Tobacco rows still lined a few fields, but many had given way to pine stands, soybeans, and wide metal roofs that held chicken houses or solar panels. The land that once carried coal red and pike red now carried different crops and different kinds of quiet. The red brick warehouse stood empty for a while, its big doors chained, weeds pushing through cracked concrete. Later, a sign went up: climate storage. New owners cut the dock down and turned the long floor into rows of storage units. Old wagon marks and yellow paint still showed under the fresh roll-up doors if you looked close. Locals dropping off boxes did not always notice the faint dark stains near the loading edge. Younger people in town knew the place more for flea markets and storage than for auctions of leaf. They'd heard about the massacre, but mostly as a fast story told on a back road. That's where the old man snapped. They did not see the way men once watched the scalehead like it was a judge. Tobacco buying itself had moved to screens and big regional centers. Electronic scales stayed, but they fed into better computers, with passwords and audits the old system never had. Some folks said those changes came because the state had caught up with the times. In quiet halls in Raleigh, a few staffers remembered it differently. They kept a thin training file that used the Hope County case as a lesson. When you ignore small fraud, you invite big harm. In one state office, down a hallway lined with framed photos of barns and fields, a door bore a simple sign: Archives. Inside, shelves held gray boxes labeled with numbers and case names. On a rainy afternoon, Agent Denise Holloway, now with more gray in her hair, signed the last form of her career. She was retiring, but before she handed in her badge, she wanted to see that one box again. A clerk rolled out a cart and set box 85C14 on the table. Its label read: Cole, Elias M., Pike, Randall C., Hope County. Denise lifted the lid and found the same things she'd seen in that motel years before. Ledgers stiff with age, a folded farm map with red dots, old floppy disks, and 2 cassettes in cracked plastics. Beside her sat a younger analyst, Carla, who tapped a laptop awake. "We scanned most of this last month," Carla said. "Tickets, logs, the map. We pulled the disk data into a spreadsheet. It's cleaner now than it ever was back then." On her screen, colored bars showed weight patterns, rising and falling like a slow wave. Denise picked up one of the tapes. Its label, in rough black letters, still read: Scale Talk, Clay. She remembered the motel speakers, the sound of Clay's laugh, the way a number dipped on the screen as his words rolled out. "You use this one in training?" she asked. Carla nodded. "Yeah, we play it for new inspectors. Tell him this is what you listen for when someone says a machine can't lie." From the narrator's view, this is the quiet reach of Elias's tech trail. His own need to be believed had built a pile of proof the state now used to teach others how not to miss fraud in small towns. It did not change his sentence, it did not raise the men he'd killed, but it did bend one part of the system a few inches toward care. Back in Hope County, a different kind of memory stayed alive. At the diner, a new waitress with a small tattoo poured coffee for an older man who had once hauled for Pike. He told her, these days they double-check them scales. They keep logs where nobody can sneak them. You thank that quiet farmer in prison for that, even if you hate him. The girl shook her head, half unsure what to believe. On a hill above the old coal place, the small cemetery grew by a few stones. Ruth's, some cousins, a baby from another branch of the family. The tree line had crept closer, and brush hid part of the view. From there, you could still see the shape of fields, the shadow of the curing barn roof, and, on clear days, the bright stripe of metal where the storage units sat where the dock used to be. Jacob drove up there sometimes in a used pickup with a child's car seat strapped in back. He worked now as a mechanic and part-time farmhand. The last of the old coal land had been sold off to pay debts, but he still held the old curing notebook under a tin box under his bed. Some nights he pulled it out, flipped through pages marked by his grandfather and father, and wondered if using it again would honor them or curse the next line. System rules had changed. Inspectors now checked electronic scales with more care. Records were kept longer. A state report, filed years after the trial, listed the Cole case under Lessons Learned.
Yet in the Sandhills, folks still leaned more on stories than on bulletins. They told their children, "Don't steal a man's heart," and in the same breath, "Don't take the law in your own hands." The land kept its own kind of memory. Red sand held roots from new pines and weeds, but under that top layer lay old furrows where men once walked behind mules, where kids once learned to tie leaf, where gunfire once echoed between barns. Institutions had moved on, files boxed and scanned, but the place itself still held the full weight of what pride, theft, and slow systems had done.
Looking back from now, it's easy to call what happened in Hawk County a murder case and stop there. Court papers do that. News clips do that. They list dates, counts, and sentences, then move on. But if you sit with this story a little longer, other questions start to push in. One of the hardest is simple. When a man is right about the wrong done to him, what does that truth buy him once blood has been spilled? Elias was not wrong about the recipe theft. He was not wrong about the rigged scales. The state's own logs and fines said so in plain print. Yet every fact he proved came tied to something he could never take back. 15 men still died on dirt and concrete. Widows still raised children alone. His own wife went into the ground with a heart worn down by loss. Jacob carried a last name that opened old wounds each time someone spoke it. No chart or tape can balance that. The tech trail he left behind shows the same split. On one hand, it worked. Inspectors learned, warehouses changed rules. New agents listened to those old cassettes and saw how small lies at a scalehead can swell into something deadly. His careful notes helped bend a distant system a little closer to fairness. On the other hand, that same record chained him. Those notebooks and maps that proved fraud also proved planning. They gave the jury a clear path to first-degree murder. The tools he trusted to defend his legacy became the tools the state used to lock him away. Protection and punishment walked together, carried by the same ink and tape. This is where local code and law stare at each other with no clean answer. In the Sandhills, folks grow up hearing that you protect your own, that you don't let someone take your family's work and laugh about it. When law feels slow or blind, the urge to make it right with your own hands is strong. That feeling shaped Elias long before he stepped onto the dock. But law has its own hard rule. No private cause, no matter how deep, makes killing a neighbor legal. Courts do not weigh mountain code or farm code. They weigh acts. Pulling a trigger, driving to each barn, aiming at men who did not all share the same level of guilt. On that scale, Elias's choice failed no matter what pushed him there. So what is legacy in a story like this? For Elias, it was a curing method, a color of leaf, a name carved into barn boards. To Clay, legacy looked more like contracts, a business that would outlive his debts, boys who could say their father made something in hard years. Both men chased a version of staying alive after they were gone. What they left is messier. Clay's line carries a shadow of fraud they could never quite step out of, even though most of them never touched the scalehead. Elias's line holds a recipe in a tin box and a history written in both pride and grief. In town, kids still hear two things in the same breath. Cole Leaf was the best we ever saw, and that name carries blood. The system learned, yet it did not heal. Better checks on scales do not mend broken chairs at kitchen tables. Training memos in Raleigh do not quiet a widow's anger when she hears he had his reasons. In that way, institutions act like those early machines. They record, they adjust, they fine. They do not forgive. Maybe the truest thing this case gives us is not an answer, but a warning. When real harm, like stolen craft and cheating, goes unhandled by the people in charge, people under them start reaching for their own rough tools. Sometimes that looks like a quiet ledger and a letter to a regulator. Sometimes it looks like a shotgun on a dock. So if you're listening from a place that feels small and overlooked, with rules that seem written for someone else, this is the question this story lays in your lap. When the system fails to guard what matters to you, how far are you willing to go to guard it yourself? And what would you be ready to lose if you did? On a mild fall afternoon, The sandhills lay quiet. The air held a thin smell of pine and dust, not smoke. Where the old warehouse once shook with shouts, a row of storage doors now faced an empty lot. A faded climate storage sign creaked in a light wind. People drove past on their way to work, barely glancing at the brick that had soaked in so much noise and blood. Up on a small rise a few miles away, gravel crunched under Jacob Cole's tires. He parked by the low fence of the hilltop cemetery and cut the engine. For a moment, he sat with both hands on the wheel, listening to cicadas and the ticking of warm metal. In the cab beside him lay a dented tin box wrapped in an old towel. He stepped out, older now, hair gone thin at the temples, shoulders thicker from years under cars instead of under leaf. The cemetery gate squeaked when he pushed it. Headstones rose in uneven rows, some leaning, some bright and new. He passed markers he knew by heart: Ruth Ellen Cole, May Ellen's Joe Parker, Darrell Pike's boy. Names tied forever to one season and one man's choice. Near a chinaberry tree at the back, he stopped at a simple stone. Elias Morgan Cole, 1937-2009. The date of death came from a state prison infirmary. Heart failure, the record had said. The body came home in a plain wooden box, carried up this hill by quiet hands who remembered both fences fixed and graves made. Jacob knelt, knees pressing into red sand, and brushed dry leaves from the base of the stone. He set the tin box down and opened it. Inside lay the curing notebook, pages browned and stiff, his grandfather's and father's handwriting layered in thin lines, temperatures, times, notes like "hold fire low" and "good color here," the recipe that had fed a family and helped burn a county. His daughter had asked about it last month. "Daddy, is it true Papa had a special way with the leaf?" His history teacher had played a clip from a podcast that told the story from far away over music and ad breaks. Jacob had seen the looks from other parents when the word Cole came up. Pride and shame had mixed in his chest like smoke. He had thought then about teaching her the method, about taking her to some small plot, showing her how a stem bends when it's ready. He had also thought about men in ditches, about widows on couches, about a father in gray who died staring at a ceiling instead of a barn roof. Some legacies carried too much weight to hand to a child without warning. Now, on that hill, he closed the notebook again. He did not burn it. He did not carry it back home. Instead, he dug a small, neat hole at the foot of the stone. The soil gave way easy, like it had for his father's shovel years before. He lowered the tin box in, set it flat, and covered it until the ground looked almost like it had when he came. A small brass tag he'd had made lay in his palm. He pressed it into the dirt. It bore only 3 words: "We remember truth." Not forgive, not forget, just that. Down in Raleigh, in a bright room full of screens, a young analyst queued up an old training file. On one monitor, charts from the warehouse logs moved as she spoke. On another, a waveform wiggled as Clay's voice played, talk of drift, of favor. In a nearby studio, a true crime host recorded a new episode about the Cole case, building it from those same sounds and scans we've walked through here. Maybe you're hearing this story now on a couch, or in a truck, or at a kitchen table that's seen its share of hard years. You've heard about a quiet farmer who proved he'd been cheated and then chose to kill. You've seen how his careful records both cleared and condemned him, how law changed a little while people carried wounds that did not. So here's where I turn it over to you. Was Elias Cole only a monster, or was he a man shaped by war, pride, theft, and a system that shrugged at his first cries? If someone stole the one real thing your family had to pass down, a skill, a name, a craft, and every door you knocked on stayed shut, how far would you go to defend it, and where would you draw your own line? Tell me in the comments what you think this was: justice twisted, pure vengeance, or something in between. And if you want more true stories that sit in that uneasy space between law and local code, between right and ruin, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.